And we are live. Welcome to another episode of Unscripted. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Marc Frankel. Thanks very much for joining. CEO and co-founder of Manifest.
Thanks so much for having me, David. I appreciate it.
I came across a couple of postings on LinkedIn, and I looked at the company, as well as we are members of the same forum. The what's a We Drum? It's a really interesting forum that meets once a week or so. But why don't we clean up palettes and do a bit of a memory lane? Walk me through. You have a really interesting, really fascinating career path. So why don't we'll start there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the group that we're a part of, the We Dram Forum, I think it's been rebranded the Vigilant Forum. It's basically national security professionals interested in cyber and risk management. But I got my career in tech about 10 years ago. I had worked in finance for a couple of years. I'd gotten a master's degree from the Fletcher School for International Security. And I was very fortunate to come out of that master's program and land a job at what was then a nascent technology, kind of NatSec technology company called Palantir. And this was back in 2013. And so I spent about 5 years there. It's where I met my co-founder, Daniel. It's where I met actually a lot of some of the best people that I've worked with. But I spent about half a decade there working in federal civilian, working in IC, Five Eyes down in Australia and New Zealand. And it was my introduction to tech. And I followed a couple really credible, really strong operators to a nascent cybersecurity company originally it was called Cadium, then it was called Expanse. Now it's Expanse, brought to you by Palo Alto Networks. But I spent about three and a half, 4 years there helping run their federal civilian, their state, local government go-to-market efforts before my co-founder Daniel called me up and he said, hey, there's something here in terms of software supply chain risk. There's something here from a SBOM regulatory perspective, but there's also something here in terms of just the national security and the enterprise risk that software supply chain is posing. And so that's after a lot of consultation, discussion, and late sleepless nights and experimentation, we decided to make a run at it and found Manifest in 2022.
And we definitely going to jump into that in a second. Somebody with your pedigree could have landed a really big role somewhere else, but you decided to create your own business. But before we jump into that, if you don't mind just double clicking on Palantir. To some people, it creates some sort of emotional response when people mention that name. Do you mind just expanding for the folks who are not familiar with the company, what it does? It's a bit of a mystical company that was, but I'm not going to steal the thunder. Why don't you just, if you don't mind, just give us a quick primer on that, because it carries some significant weight here.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the example that I always give folks, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, the big tome that came out in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, one of the biggest observations, conclusions, discoveries, etc., was that the United States intelligence community had all the information that it needed to stop the 9/11 attacks, but it had it in disparate silos. The FBI knew something, the CIA knew something, Customs and Border Patrol knew something, the FAA knew something, but they weren't able to stitch all of that information together. And that's really, if you think about it, that's a fundamental problem. And it's a fundamental problem as our enterprises grow more complex, is that we're going to have more data residing in more disparate places. There needs to be a way to bring all of that data together. And so that's really at its core what Palantir does, is it provides this integration layer for disparate bits of information to be able to be analyzed in a centralized repository. And so, irrespective of whether you are trying to intercept the next 9/11 attack, or whether you are looking for the drug dealers, or whether you are looking for missing children, or you are looking for missing packages, The workflows are basically the same, which is that you have different pieces of information housed in different data sets, and they all need to be able to talk to each other in a common operating platform. Where I suppose not acrimony, but the suspicion, the reputation that Palantir has garnered is that it is a really powerful thing to be able to bring data sets from different places together in service of workflows that were never previously possible. And so, to give a more benign example, it could be that you have an oil well from a Fortune 500 oil energy company. And that oil well has different parts on it, and you have a maintenance database, and you have a spare parts database, and you have a shipping database, and you have an HR database. So you have to stitch all of those things together to say, which of my parts are likely to fail, which are the ones that I have in inventory, which are the people who can install them, and what are some of the problems that happen when we install one of those things. That's a very powerful workflow. It's a very benign workflow. You could see, obviously, from a privacy and civil liberties perspective, how this might open up concerns at the national security level. For what it's worth, and listeners to your show can or cannot ascribe to this as much as they want. The work that I did at Palantir was some of the work that I'm proudest of in my career. There was never once there was never once a situation where I was thrust in a position where there were a handful of data sets that were being combined in a way that would infringe upon people's civil liberties. In fact, quite the opposite. The fact that you have this data governance capability means that you are less likely to infringe upon civil liberties as compared to the Wild West, where you're pulling things more or less ad hoc from disparate databases.
Yeah, and it's super interesting that this kind of process of connecting data sets to create a kind of inference and a new image of the, whatever the case may be. Like, this is done in the consumer world, right? For example, credit card companies are selling their information, social media sites are selling the information, everybody intersects to allow for better targeting. And sometimes it flows, and there's a controversial around that. Recently, it came about that the certain viewers of YouTube videos were, I wouldn't say targeted, but the information was then consumed by one of the agencies. I guess they released a certain video, and then whoever watched it was then scrutinized. And somebody was saying, rightfully so, because potentially you can just get a link from somebody. So it's the fact that you clicked on the video or viewed it for a couple of minutes doesn't necessarily mean that you're a proponent of any type of ideas. But it's super interesting. And what's also interesting that this allow you were exposed to people as very different caliber, right? The folks that are part of that organization, I'm not surprised that a lot of them left to found new businesses and create new enterprise, because the type of people that joined that effort were quite unique. You can see that sometimes in, I'm assuming it's like almost being like ex-Navy SEAL in the enterprise world, right?
I couldn't do anywhere near the right number of push-ups to make anything approximate.
Mental push-ups.
There certainly don't want to be accused of like the stolen dollar thing by any stretch of the imagination. Those guys do things that I'm probably not even allowed to dream of. But I think the point that you're trying to make is that the bar was high for execution. And yes, the bar was definitely high for execution. And that's something that we've taken in our careers since.
And walk me through, this is interesting because the journey of the entrepreneurs take typically reside in, a lot of times, with somebody during their work or their experiences or their roles and responsibility come across a problem that hasn't been solved yet. And I think this was the case as well. Do you want to describe what the problem is in terms of what was discovered that there's no solution for, what you decided to create Manifest?
Yeah. The easiest way to describe it is the 2-second kind of a light bulb moment for us, because that, and particularly for my co-founder Daniel, was that software is the only thing that we buy that you don't get to know what's in. And it's insane when you think about it that it's 2024 and we procure software without asking that basic question. And it's something that it's almost so obvious that nobody really thinks about. But if you think about it, if you were to go to the grocery store and you were to buy a box of Raisin Bran, the FDA for 100 years has required General Mills to disclose to you what's inside this box of Raisin Bran, right? It contains bran flakes and sugar and raisins and food coloring and all that good stuff. When you buy a house, you get a home inspection. When you buy a t-shirt, it says 80% cotton and 20% polyester. We have grown accustomed as consumers to the fact that we ought to have the right to understand what's inside this thing that we're going to buy. Software is this one glaring exception. And that's a really dangerous thing. The first 40 to 50 years of software, it was known that this was a gap, but it wasn't necessarily that pernicious. And there have been a rise of, some of them have made front page news, software supply chain vulnerabilities. So the Apache Strutzes and the SolarWinds and the Log4Shells of the world that have made front page news, that have cost billions of dollars in remediation, that have burned out cybersecurity professionals throughout the industry. And it basically laid bare the fact that the Western world doesn't require an inventory of the software that it buys, just like the FDA requires an inventory for Raisin Bran, or so on and so forth down the list. And where this really hit home, particularly for Daniel, but also for me, was the Log4Shell vulnerability. So for any listeners who aren't familiar, Log4j is a logging application. It's an open source component widely used by 12 million Java developers all around the world. In December of 2021, it was discovered that there was a vulnerability with the Log4j logging application. It wasn't anybody's fault. It was something that bad actors had discovered. There was a way to exploit this particular bit of open source software. And the reason why that was particularly bad is because this open source software was spread, like I said, across 12 million plus Java applications. But it was also bad because the day that the security vulnerability was disclosed was the day that it was disclosed that there was an exploit in the wild. And so unlike most software vulnerabilities where it's disclosed and the vendor produces a patch and maybe at some point down the line an exploit is developed, this was, there's an exploit in the wild today, go and patch your things immediately. I was at Palo Alto Networks at the time. My co-founder Daniel was at DoD. And even though Palo's a $100 billion publicly traded company focused on cybersecurity, and even though DoD is the largest, arguably one of the largest enterprises in the world, it wasn't easy to answer this one seminal question of where do we have Log4j in our environment? And Daniel and I looked at each other and we said, this problem isn't going away. It's not like APTs and whoever else are going to abandon the software supply chain vulnerability threat pattern. This is something that we're really, as a society, going to need to get ahead of. And that was the, or not get ahead of, at least catch up on. That was the impetus for us founding Manifest. The answer to the problem, we don't know what's in the software that we build and buy, is a list of ingredients of what's in the software that we build and buy. And that list of ingredients is known as an SBOM, a software bill of materials. They come in two different formats, CycloneDX or SPDX. People have made their careers defining what those formats would be. And they were in the early stages of adoption when Daniel and I decided to take the leap and start Manifest, but they were by no means a household name. They weren't in every enterprise. And we looked around and we said, hey, an SBOM, a list of ingredients, unlike when you go and you buy a box of cereal at the grocery store and it has 15 ingredients, here we might be talking about 1,500 ingredients. If we get to that point where software vendors are transmitting these lists of ingredients to their software consumers, what are the software consumers supposed to do with this 1,500 component long piece of JSON? And that was the gap that we saw in the market, was that This is in order for SBOMs, in order for there to be software supply chain transparency, there has to be SBOMs. In order for SBOMs to take off, there has to be a way to consume SBOMs. And that's what we focused the last 2 years on building.
And I remember the Log4j, right? Log4Shell. I remember that it created like massive waves in the cybersecurity community. People attributed to being like an atom bomb, cyber, and I remember every single vendor jumped on the bandwagon to say they either can mitigate it or prevent it or whatever the case may be. And as often this happens in this case, nothing really happened. The sky didn't fall. There weren't like any major impact. How do you explain that? Are we always chasing sensational news? I can definitely see what you describe as being a cardinal problem. But just coming back to these events like SolarWinds and so on, SolarWinds is still around. They still have their customers. Nobody stopped using Java.
Yeah.
So what's your take on it?
Yeah. I'm going to borrow the Gartner hype cycle thing, right? It's humans follow a pattern. There's, what is it? The peak of hype, and then there's like a trough of disillusionment. These things do go through these sorts of patterns. And
we also have recency bias, right? So
that's exactly it. Yeah. So these things go through patterns. We have recency bias. We overweight the recent. We underweight the distant past. We definitely underweight the thing that hasn't happened yet. We don't get ahead of things that we anticipate are problems because we're so busy fighting the problems that we know to be problems today. Irrespective of where you fall, you're absolutely right. It doesn't really, the exploitable threat pattern for a Log4Shell could have been buying green bananas, and you would have ended up with 500 security companies saying that they guard against green bananas. I don't think there's much that we can glean from the way that the vendor industry ecosystem has responded, because that's just a very predictable playbook. I do think, however, that the way that we purchase software needs to change fundamentally. When we sell our software, or when Palantir sells their software, or anybody else sells their software, the vendor due diligence process is onerous. Do you have SOC 2? Do you have ISO 27001? Do you do background checks on your developers? Do you have a disaster recovery site 93 miles away from your main instance? Do you have any foreign investors? They poke and prod at everything that is on the periphery of the application that is to be deployed. Most of it is company centric, right? Are you solvent as a company? Do you have two-factor authentication, right? It's all nibbling away at the edges. The core of this problem is what's inside this thing. What am I going to trust with my patient health information, my personally identifiable information, potentially my classified data? And that's a problem that, irrespective of hype cycles, or irrespective of Log4Shell, or irrespective of whatever, that's a problem that's not going away. And our GRC and third-party risk management professionals deserve better than having to read a 200-page vendor due diligence questionnaire that was filled out by sales engineers who are singularly focused on getting past this 200-page vendor due diligence questionnaire and just making this problem go away. They deserve quantified, ungamifiable artifacts, technical artifacts, and they deserve a way to consume them in a way that doesn't require a PhD in computer science to make sense of them. And that's really where I think SBOM it has both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is it has this enormous potential to transform the way that we perform third-party risk management on our software applications. However, the other side of that sword is that it is a highly technical artifact that is extraordinarily valuable to non-technical people. And that's a real problem, because if there isn't tooling in place to enable folks without a PhD in cyber risk management to make sense of a 1,500 component SBOM, it's never going to be widely adopted because it's too difficult to adopt. And so somewhere where we've had some discussions with this is a SBOM adoption working group and a couple of folks in industry is like, how do we make this approachable so that it's the easiest thing that a TPRM professional does as opposed to the hardest?
And one could argue that everything is software, right? Because we're becoming a digital economy. The software is getting embedded into almost everything, and that is only accelerating. How do you explain the fact that we are, as a society, advancing into the digital age, but yet this particular area, as you described, is so behind from a scrutiny perspective? Why there's no more regulation and more like an FDA that does that? Because we're consumer of software, but it's still there's no ingredients associated with.
Yeah, so the good news is this regulation is here, or it's come. President Biden in May of 2021 signed Executive Order 14028, which stipulated, among many other things, that the federal civilian government can begin requiring SBOMs from its vendors. And indeed, you're already starting to see this. The Department of State here in the US has begun requiring SBOMs from its vendors. You have various components in DoD that are requiring SBOMs from the Defense Industrial Base. The FDA has come out and said that they're no longer going to approve software-enabled medical devices, the pre-market submission package, without it being accompanied by an SBOM, and they're going to scrutinize that SBOM. So you are seeing regulation take hold. The US has really been at the forefront of this. The EU just passed something called the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA, which was, and I always get this wrong because I'm not a European Union bureaucracy policy specialist, but in March they passed the CRA. I think in April it's formally adopted, and then there's like a 2-year window before enforcement will begin. But it's going to require any software vendors in the EU, either doing business with the EU or domiciled in the EU, et cetera, to begin producing SBOMs for their applications and make them available to regulators upon request. And the penalty for non-compliance can be up to 15 million euros, which is quite a lot of teeth if you think about a carrot and stick type approach here. And so we are seeing more regulation. It's being thought of in Japan. It's being thought of in South Korea. There are other jurisdictions that are thinking about SBOM. There are also industry guidelines and industry regulations. So for instance, in the automotive space, the UN, there's the UNECE R155 regulation that puts a whole bunch of requirements on cybersecurity requirements on manufacturers of wheeled vehicles. And one of the things is that one of the stipulations is that they have an inventory and a cybersecurity, a vulnerability management process. One of the things that it alludes to is that they would have an SBOM management program as well. So you are seeing in different verticals at different levels of maturity in different geographies, more of a regulatory mandate towards this. I think the reason why it has to be regulatorily driven is because I think, as you articulated earlier, people are busy, right? There's always like the latest shiny thing. There's always a new threat vector. And so to adopt something that is a theoretical risk, or, hey, Log4Shell has been out there for 2.5 years and we haven't been bitten yet, like how bad could it be? Turning that into a statutorily required thing is a way of addressing the human nature part of this, of you don't have a choice, you have to do this. And the last thing that I'll say on that is that I wrote this was a couple of months ago now, I wrote a blog post comparing SBOM regulatory requirements to regulatory requirements on the food industry from like the 1909 Fair Food and Drug Labeling Act here in the United States or something like that. And the pushback from the food industry was exactly the same as the pushback from the software industry today. It's too expensive, it's proprietary, I don't know how to do this, what format does it need to be in, people aren't going to know what they're looking at, it's going to cause undue concern, confusion, etc., which really to me evinces that this isn't a software problem, this is a human nature problem. It's how do we convince industry to adopt greater transparency? And that's a lesson that my suspicion is we're just going to keep learning over and over again.
I think the software industry should adopt it the same way as the labeling, right? So some companies use the labeling to showcase that their product is of higher quality,
Yep.
meaning that is, but sometimes it's taken the wrong way. For example, they put 0%, zero or no cholesterol on something that's not even
Filled with sugar or whatever. Yeah.
well, no cholesterol. Cholesterol is only it's only related to animal byproduct or animal
Yeah.
produced. And so if you put in no cholesterol on olive oil, it just has no, but it's, so coming back to software, the idea is they can adopt this and basically showcase that they have potentially higher quality software components or whatever the case may be to showcase you're more compliant or have gone through the rigorous security controls associated. So, what's your take on that? To be able to
Yep.
adopt that, and would you see potentially these type of labels, quote unquote, saying keto friendly, but
Yeah.
on the software side?
Yes. So where it's a great question. Yes. Like you ought to be able to say, hey, we have an SBOM for this product. We ran it through NVD and OSV and EPSS and KEV and all these other vulnerability databases. It came back scot clean. I get an A plus. You can have confidence in this thing. Where the analogy breaks down with food is that if you were to have a box of Cheez-Its and Nabisco were to say, hey, here are the ingredients in Cheez-Its, and we promise that it doesn't have any pencil shavings or whatever, that's a static thing, right? The box gets vacuum sealed or whatever and it ends up on your shelf, and then you go and you buy the Cheez-Its, and every now and then there's like a recall that's announced. Problem is, there's kind of two problems that securing software has that's a little bit different. One is that it can be upgraded, right? I have yet to see a box of Cheez-Its that came with an upgrade path to it. But two is that the potential dangers to it change. There are new vulnerabilities that are added to NVD on a daily, weekly, etc. basis. The nature of those vulnerabilities changes, what versions they affect changes, the exploitable path. Security researchers come up with new information. And not every vulnerability is created equal, right? There's 200,000 vulnerabilities in NVD, but there's only 5 to 7% of them that ever end up with an exploit being developed for them. So it's simultaneously a case of there are new bad things being discovered all the time. Not every bad thing was created equal. And the nature of the thing that you're evaluating is changing all the time too. So it's not exactly the same as just stamping like a good housekeeping seal of approval on the side of a box, but we should be able to get to a point where at least we say, hey, as of March 31st or April 1st or whatever, this was the adjudication or this was the score. And then we have it persistently updated thereafter. Absolutely.
And do you think that, for example, coming back to the analogy with the food labeling, I still try to eat what's good for me, but then the food industry found a way to name sugar in 10 different ways to obfuscate. No, I'm serious.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, is that a potential drawback of labeling of software? Are you going to find they're going to have the same similar type of controls?
Yeah,
or?
there's a whole nother conversation to be had about the naming convention problem. Basically, like, how do we standardize a way where we can compare software? How is it that every software package gets a unique identifier so that it can be with 100% accuracy compared to every vulnerability? Right now, basically, there's a lot of qualitative aspects to this. You could have one person who makes an Acme component, another person who makes an Acme component. You have semantic versioning in terms of comparing affected versions, etc. So it's definitely, it's a problem worth solving. You are also absolutely correct in that whenever you foist new requirements onto an industry, they're going to find ways to push back. And one of the ways that they can push back is by technically providing an SBOM, a list of their third-party and open source components, but doing so in a way that is potentially deliberately undigestible, right? So if you're a software vendor and you have 300 individual repos and they all come together to make the product that you sold to the US government. There's no rule currently that says that you have to provide one piece of JSON that has all of those individual repo SBOMs merged together in a clean and neat way. You could provide them with a tarball of 300 JSON artifacts and tell them, hey, good luck, go to town. The other challenge is that on the consumption side, even if you are matching software components to software vulnerabilities, you're only some percentage of the way to utility, right? You need to contextualize what environment is this application going to be deployed in, right? If it's an air-gapped environment, you have to worry a lot less about something that requires access to the public internet. You could even potentially use log4j version 2.14 as long as it's not using one of the two affected scripts out of the 122 scripts here, however many there are code paths. It's not quite such an easy thing of saying, hey, bit of JSON in, control F 200,000 times, observations out. There's a lot of nuance and complexity that comes with it, but at the very, like where we are is very much in the crawl phase of, we just have to get software vendors inventorying their components and making those inventories available and making it easy to consume at least a nascent way. And then we can work on solving the walk and the run problems down.
But Mark, it sounds like there's a bit of a mystery here, right? In terms of how to get it just right. And you know, they say where there's mystery, there are margins. So it sounds like you've really put a lot of thought into not just the management of the kind of the list of what's allowed and the components associated, but how it's related to the overall picture of risk mitigation, really, essentially, and applying that to the supply chain. Talk to me about specifically how, maybe what's the secret sauce and how do you integrate into an existing third-party risk? So TPRM and threat programs were been around for a long time. This is fairly established components, but then now it looks like there's almost like a new vector associated with the risk for third party. Talk to me about how do you integrate with existing systems, and how do you overcome like all the complexities associated? Because again, somebody who just comes in, no one has the time and energy to start figuring everything out. I guess that's where Manifest comes in.
Yeah, so for our very first customer, which is in the healthcare space, we supported, but we also saw the difficulty that the GRC team had in adopting an SBOM program, right? They didn't know the CycloneDX format from the SPDX format. They,
and Mark, can I ask you a question? How did they even know they needed one? What was the driver behind this? I'm really curious.
Yeah, so for our very first customer, it was us. It was us bringing this to them and telling them, hey, they said that they had heard about SBOMs, but they weren't even really sure where to begin. And so we walked them through that onboarding process of even down to the very brass tacks of what does the contract language look like? If we're going to adapt our MSAs, our legal people don't know what an SBOM is, right? What contract language should we use? How much time should we give people to provide an SBOM? What is the email that goes out to our vendor that stipulates what we need and in what format we need it in? And so we helped this very first customer of ours 2 years ago build out this material. And we realized that it was desperately needed for every single one of our other customers. Everyone was starting their SBOM, their third-party SBOM program from scratch. And so having a Mad Lib style email and a Mad Lib style follow-up email and a Mad Lib style third email and answers to the pre-baked answers to the frequently asked questions of, why do you need this? How am I supposed to get this to you? How is it going to be secured? Isn't this my proprietary secret sauce? Virtually all of the vendors that we help our customers interact with have the same 5, maybe 6 initial questions. How do we get ahead of that so that the SBOM upload portal has those FAQ answers right there? how do we automate as much of this process as we possibly can? And I think just from my experience in cybersecurity is oftentimes if you're a cybersecurity vendor, and say, cool, I'm going to do one technical party trick and I'm going to make it available to a security team and they're going to know what to do with it because they're the experts and they're going to integrate it with their other SOC and VM and other capabilities. And that's going to be my contribution. And what we discovered when we were helping our vendors get off the line with our customers get off the line with vendor SBOMs is that helping solve the human problem really, it helped us not only build goodwill, but ensure that our deployments were a success. Because otherwise, if you hand somebody a new requirement and say, hey, this is your Q3 of 2024 goal, is to have this up and run. Well, now they have to do all that research that we just did for our first end customers. Why wouldn't we productize this? Why wouldn't we make it available to our customers to say, hey, here's your playbook, here's your list of vendors, here's your email, here's your contract language, here's how you answer their 5 questions, here's how we're going to coach you up and make you an expert in this space so that you don't have to do all this hard work from the beginning and not build off of the experiences who have come before.
And were there situations where you essentially open up a Pandora's box, like you all of a sudden realize that you have a critical vendor that is maybe not large enough to maintain or make some significant changes in their source code, but yet I guess the repository or whatever they were using was vulnerable. And so now you're facing the challenge to, and that happens quite a bit, I think, in traditional TPRM. You have a company that is too small to maintain its own security posture, but yet it's critical. How do you solve that? What's the kind of the full life cycle to get to the point where the risk is manageable?
Yeah. The answer is never stick your head in the sand, right? This is an argument that we hear is, I'm not going to become amateur AppSec for 5,000 vendors, right? But the answer can't be, then don't know about it. The Log4Shell example was a great example, right? Instead of having to reach out to 5,000 vendors, do the work when you're onboarding the vendors to collect these SBOMs, and then be one click away from understanding where you're exposed. And if it's a small mom and pop critical vendor that you can't live without, now you understand what you have to mitigate, right? Maybe patient health information doesn't go into that system. Maybe you write up a POAM that says by contract renewal, they will remediate X, Y, and Z. Maybe it does have to be quarantined and taken offline until there's a patch available. But not knowing is never the answer. Maybe there's like attorneys somewhere out there who will say from like a liability perspective, not knowing is the answer. But the head in the sand approach is not the way that we're going to solve this. If you have small software vendors, all the more reason to institute an SBOM requirement because they are the ones, they present a tremendous amount of risk, right? You have a very long tail. The AWSs and the Microsofts and the whoever's of the world, they have dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of product security people. The idea that you're going to ask for their SBOM and you're going to run it through NVD and have some magic light bulb moment that the Bezoses of the world didn't discover first is probably pretty low. It's going to be that long tail of your smaller, not even necessarily mom and pop, but up and coming nascent, the types of vendors that you brought on because you wanted an advantage in business are the ones that are developing the most quickly, software developing the most quickly, and the ones that you probably need to keep an eye on the most.
And how do you do that continuously? You touch upon that specifically, the ability to monitor different versions of the software and be on top of it in a continuous manner and then updating it and notifying. Again, it's not about the one and done. You can't do this like once a quarter or once a year and be confident. Yep. Some software is being updated on a weekly basis.
Yep. Yeah. The cadence of updates is something that's being solved in a more heterogeneous fashion. So you have some, I'll pick on investment banks. So you have some banks that are requiring updates quarterly from their vendors. So you have some that are requiring them annually. You have some that are requiring them on every major release. We still are very much in the crawl phase of all of this. And so the crawl phase is give it to me once when I buy your software. And for a lot of on-prem deployed applications, that's actually good enough. If you think about an MRI machine, for instance, you buy a fleet of MRI machines, those MRI machines get installed in a hospital wing floor, and they might sit there for 10 or 15 years. That's not to say that they don't come with software patches and upgrades and everything, but we're not talking about SaaS that's being updated 4 times a day necessarily. Mm-hmm. Where the persistent monitoring is most valuable or most important is on the persistent monitoring of new vulnerabilities. So you gather all of these SBOMs, you perform your pre-procurement due diligence, you run them through, like I said, NVD and OSV and whatever else, and you come up with an adjudication, right? This is a acceptable risk or an unacceptable risk. But then the next evolution of that is, now how do I keep tabs on this application every single day that it's installed in my network? And so that's what we do at Manifest, is we're checking new vulnerabilities and updates to existing vulnerabilities every day. The failure mode would be if you do all this work to put SBOM requirements in an MSA, and you collect the JSON and you scan it for vulnerabilities, and then you put it in a SharePoint folder. It's not helping anybody get any more secure if it just sits in that SharePoint folder as a compliance artifact. It needs to be checked on a daily or sub-daily basis.
And since you are in a unique position to have an oversight of the overall software industry from a SBOM risk perspective, I'm sure you've thought about it, but you can generate some serious insight, like in terms of trends you're seeing from a risk perspective. You would even argue that maybe there's a way for you to do a minority report style where you know a software is going to become rogue and become risky. Have you thought about that?
Not necessarily to that extent. I mean it when I say, like, the bar right now is collect SBOMs from your vendors. Full stop. Once we get there, we can talk about, there's some really interesting things that you could hypothesize we can do once we end up with a meaningful timeline of SBOMs, is you can infer things about a vendor's software development lifecycle practices, right? How quickly did they patch after a Log4j? How quickly did they patch after pick your other software supply chain vulnerability, right? What is the mean time to patch, the mean time to remediation? That's a very rich data set that you could make a lot of really interesting inferences from. The crawl phase is, hey, let's get SBOMs from all of our vendors and be proactively notified when we have Log4 shell. The run phase is, hey, let's anticipate which of our vendors we suspect we will have a problem with in the future. There's a bank that actually, just from a compliance perspective, said to all of its vendors, give me your SBOM. They said, we know that this is a net new requirement. Give me your SBOM or give me 20% off. And so there are levers that you can pull to promote compliance. But that kind of like minority report style, hey, we can, using AI, we can anticipate which vendor is going to have a problem on September 23rd of 2027. We're not quite there.
Well, you can eventually provide some sort of almost like risk or credit rating associated with particular software.
Absolutely.
Depending on their track record and, as you mentioned, their inference on the development and patching life cycles and so on. So there's value there. Speaking of AI, since you brought it up, we're looking at AI assistant writing codes and so on. So they're saying that the kind of software developers' salaries are the kind of race to the bottom because there's going to be AI writing software, essentially, maybe with augmented by human intervention. But the one thing that is for certain is the amount of code that's going to be generated. It will probably exponentially go higher.
Mhm.
And that will actually increase the need for an SBOM, but it will also, anybody can take a software package and ask the ChatGPT to review it and maybe to create a nuance or make some changes. Are you ready for that explosion in code versions? Is it,
Yeah. So the explosion code versions, yes. There's not like a scale problem necessarily when it comes to SBOMs, or at least not in the early stages of industry adoption that we're seeing so far. The bigger question though is, how are we going to, really it comes down to less AI necessarily, but more just automation. How are we going to, if you're going to have N versions of SBOMs and you're going to be collecting, or N versions of software and you're going to be collecting SBOMs for every one of them, how do we make that transmission layer between the software vendor and the software consumer automated? Because if you're relying on a human compliance person to email a human vendor due diligence person a JSON file and then rely on that recipient party to upload it into a portal where it spits out a report and then that report is manually reviewed, you're going to get left in the dust. And so one thing that we have invested heavily in is, how do we automate the transmission layer between SBOM pitcher and SBOM catcher, so that with a new version of a new software application from one of your vendors who is generating SBOMs for each new version, how can they transmit that securely to Manifest? How can Manifest perform that analysis? How can it spit out that adjudication either to an individual or to a third-party risk management portal? And then how can they go and take action on whatever findings, create tickets, generate reports, push back, write an email back to the vendor? How can you automate all that process? Because the greater the N, the less the appetite there will be for a human in the middle of this process.
fantastic, Mark. I have so many questions, but I feel like we're running out of time. But I'd love to ask you one more really critical question.
Please.
How do you get started? What are your recommendations? Somebody who's in the middle of this, from an enterprise perspective, who wants to enforce and build an SBOM program, and then on the other side, you're a software vendor, and you want to be compliant, and you want to use. You don't have to wait for the 20% off. You just want to have all your ducks in a row. So maybe the recommendation for both sides.
Yeah. So from a software vendor perspective, and here I'll shill a little bit for Manifest, although lots of tools that will help generate you an SBOM. The SBOM generation capability has really expanded over the course of the last 5 years in the industry. And GitHub has a button that says generate SBOM, and Microsoft open sourced a tool called Salus. CycloneDX has its own open source tool. There are a lot of tools out there that will help you generate an SBOM. The thing that we always advocate is, in the spirit of what you just asked me, is you have to make it scalable. You can't be ringing a bell every third Thursday of the month and telling all of your developers, hey, it's SBOM Thursday, everybody go and generate this JSON artifact and put it in the SharePoint folder. You have to put it in the CI/CD pipeline so that every time there's a new build of a new application, stamping out a new SBOM, and it's creating that artifact and it's going into a centralized repository. From there, you ought to be able to have tagging and labeling and analysis and secure sharing and merging and all the bells and whistles. But the SBOM generation process really ought to be automated. We've invested very heavily for our customers in getting them. One of my favorite stories was a defense contractor that we deployed at who had no SBOM generation capability. And we got them from standstill to generating SBOMs for all of their repos in 90 seconds. The SBOM generation piece of this can be done, and it's not as scary as you think. From a third-party risk management perspective, from a how do I consume these artifacts? Look, there is a certain administrative process that you and your team are going to have to go to, right? You're going to have to get the director of GRC's sign off to start collecting these things. You're going to have to update your OneTrust or your Wistic or whatever the survey is that you're currently using to make question 1B upload your SBOM here in CycloneDX or SPDX format. But we have all of that language. That's all done. So if there's a listener out there who's saying, hey, I'm intimidated, I don't have time for this, like we're happy to share the SBOM outreach playbook with them and just say, here's the Mad Libs email, here's how you go and you ask your vendors. That part is very easy. It's the engagement with vendors, depending on who your vendors are and how many of them there are, that end up being the difficult part. And the internal organizational change. That's the part where people can get bogged down. But like I said, we've been through this rodeo before. We're happy to help where we can.
And Mark, as you mentioned, it's better not to put your head in the sand. So you better to take a look at it. Mark, we're running out of time, but what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you to learn more about Manifest and just in general? What's the easiest way?
Yeah, absolutely. info@manifestcyber.com, all one word. We're available at manifestcyber.com if you want to learn about SBOMs, but also AI bombs, which is a topic that we didn't touch on. How do you inventory what's in your AI? Just like if you want to inventory your software. We'll be at Open Source Summit. Swing by and say hello.
That's fantastic, Mark. We'll maybe do episode 2 on AI bombs. I think we're just this year open up the can of worms. But
they look to regret it.
But until then, Mark, thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciated. It was an enlightening conversation. I learned a lot specifically. And for those who joined, thank you very much for joining. Looking forward to seeing the next episode. And until then, stay safe online as well as offline. See you soon.